regarding key trafficking problems and issues related to their countries. The State Department believes that these specified forms of training largely track their current activities. Thus, while adding these examples to the statute will ensure that the types of training will continue, it will not result in a substantial and additional cost. Again, I thank the leadership of the gentleman, Mr. Maloney from New York, as the primary sponsor of this, and I would reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of my bill, H.R. 4449, the Human Trafficking Prevention Act, and yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to also thank my colleague, Mr. Meadows, for his leadership on this bill. I'd like to thank the Democratic whip, my friend, the gentleman from Maryland, Steny Hoyer, and his staff for the work they dedicated to this piece of legislation, and to my own staff. Worldwide, less than 1% of an estimated 27 million victims of human trafficking have been reported. In the past year, only about 44,000 survivors have been identified. Millions, literally millions, of children, women, and men are trafficked each year and forced into modern-day slavery as part of the world's most evil and fastest-growing industry. And it may seem like it only happens on the other side of the world, but it's happening here, in quiet neighborhoods across our country. Some of those survivors are from neighborhoods I represent, in the Hudson Valley of New York, in New Windsor, and Newburgh. For nearly 4 years, one man would troll the streets, coercing at least 10 women to work for him as sex workers in local motels. Last year, law enforcement authorities uncovered an international sex trafficking ring operating brothels in Yonkers, in Poughkeepsie, in Newburgh, where women were brutalized and forced to have sex 10, 20, 30 times a day. It's a hard truth, but it's a truth nonetheless. This disgusting, this horrifying practice of modern-day slavery happens here, right here, in our own neighborhoods, in our own backyards, in our own country. Even with the assistance of law enforcement and dedicated organizations like My Sister's Place in Westchester, like Safe Homes in Orange County, groups which help survivors rebuild their lives, New York continues to be one of the top hubs of human trafficking, where sex trafficking, child labor, child sex trafficking, and indentured servitude happen all too frequently. In another community in the Hudson Valley, about an hour away from New York City, a man tricked teenage girls to travel to the United States on tourist visas from countries like Brazil, Hungary, and France. He instructed these women to lie to both immigration and State Department officials in order to gain access to our country. It is precisely this kind of situation that my legislation seeks to stop. We must ensure that our men and women on the front lines of our borders have the resources and training they need in order to identify and stop human trafficking at its source before these women and children and men become victims. As part of our goal to end human trafficking, we can make sure that our foreign service officers and other government personnel have the tools and training they need to spot, to identify these victims and stop this trafficking across international borders. In the past, the State Department estimated that between 14,500 and 17,000 foreign nationals were trafficked into the United States every single year. Although the federal government has a zero-tolerance policy on human trafficking, our foreign service officers, who often have face-to-face contact with these victims when they're obtaining U.S. visas, currently undergo minimal training to define, identify, and recognize the indicators of human trafficking or smuggling. My legislation would expand new minimum training procedures for foreign service officers and other government personnel in order to identify and stop human trafficking at its source and take action before people are trafficked across international borders, before it becomes too late, when they're already in the United States and already victimized. Since we know criminals will do just about anything to adapt and to avoid being caught, this legislation also requires annual updates on key problems, threats, methods, and warning signs of trafficking. I want to thank my colleagues across the aisle because by working across the aisle, we have a new opportunity to come together to combat this absolutely monstrous practice of trafficking in children, women, and men. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to support my legislation, H.R. 4449, the Human Trafficking Prevention Act. I thank you, and I yield back my